I compiled this video last night highlighting some of the most gut-wrenching cases of animal attacks on humans covered on the channel thus far. Some of these are recent, and many of them are notorious for just how bizarre and deadly they turned out. These stories include the story of a man who was mauled by a hippo just outside his home while preparing dinner, the case of a young man who was stung multiple times by a box jellyfish on what was meant to be a routine surf, a brutal recent bear attack on a woman and her dog in Pennsylvania, the story of a man who released a venomous cobra into his wife and child's bedroom while they were asleep, the details of the infamous true story that Quint from Jaws left out regarding the worst shark attack in history, and much more. Hit that like and subscribe button if you're new. You're watching When Animals Attack. It was early September of 2022 in the village of Ndire in Maragua County, Kenya, and farmer David Njoroge was preparing supper after a long day of hard work. It seemed like an ordinary evening as the normally loud and busy streets finally settled into the quiet of the night. But this peaceful ambiance suddenly shattered when David heard a loud commotion outside his house. As he rushed out the door to investigate, little did he know that a large and highly agitated hippo was lurking just around the corner. On September 12, 2022, 50-year-old Kenyan farmer David Njoroge had just arrived home after a long, hard day of laborious work. It was about 7 p.m., and typically David would around this time prepare dinner for him and his wife, and this day seemed no different. Just when David finished cooking, he abruptly heard an array of shouting and screaming outside his home. I had just gotten home from a long day of work and was ready to have dinner when suddenly I heard a loud noise coming from behind my house. I ran outside to find out what the commotion was. Initially, I thought the villagers had cornered a thief, but to my surprise it was a hippopotamus, and as I saw it charging at me, I frantically climbed up a tree. But because I was in such a state of immense panic, I lost my balance and fell to the ground, which is when the hippo bit into my right shoulder and pulled a large chunk of flesh from it. I felt weak. I felt way too weak and in too much pain at that point, so I decided to play dead. And this bought me some time, I guess, as just moments later, the other villagers rushed towards me and managed to fend the hippo off. Where did this hippo come from? It came from a place called Kazuki Dam, also known as Kibiko Dam. My only request is to try to get rid of these hippos so that people can farm and live peacefully. Last night when the hippo came, I watched as the hippo charged my husband and bit into his arm. We then rushed him to the hospital. We both request that the government helps us with the hospital bills, as he is the main breadwinner in our home, and of course he won't be able to work because he has to recover from this injury. We also hope for these hippos to be caught and locked up, and for the government to close down these dams so villagers can be free from this constant lingering threat and finally live in peace. Although hippos kill more humans than any mammal in the world, it's important to note that most of these attacks go undocumented. In fact, I've only been able to find limited information on a handful of cases such as this one, and the reason for this is mainly because most of these attacks take place in rural regions of Africa, where the vast majority of them go unreported or are very limitedly covered. Even a basic Google search only brings back just 2 popular cases that have already been covered on the channel, and this is quite surprising given how many attacks are said to happen every year. Having said this, I was able to gather some interview clips from various villagers in Kenya who live and work in the surrounding villages where this attack took place, and many people claim that hippos have and continue to terrorize their villages.
And this is not all. They say the dangerous animal has been a threat to school-going children and the residents who go to work early in the morning.
Hata watoto wanaopitia hapa asubuhi sana wakienda kwa shule, hata kama kuna hippo ziko huku na hippo kama hiyo inaweza tokea. Kukiwa kumefensiwa kidogo, watawa na wakati mwema wa kupitia, watakuwa na security mzuri.
Given how hard life is for these villagers, especially from a financial standpoint, the fact that hippos are known to wreak havoc in more ways than one, such as destroying massive amounts of these farmers' crops, has been devastating to a people who are already struggling to get by.
The farmers looking on as they count their losses. The hippo was here, leaving a trail of destruction. The residents of Katibanga village in Murang'a County woke up to this, but this is not the first time. For 3 months now, they have had to deal with the invasion of their farms, and as a result, the damaged food crops.
And of course, not only are crops affected, but many people as well are attacked and even killed by these highly territorial animals. Here's another example in the Katibanga Dam, where 4 people around the time of the making of this footage that you see here had been fatally attacked by hippos.
Residents gathered at the Katibanga Dam in Maragua after receiving news that the dam had claimed yet another life. The 60-year-old man is believed to have gone fishing when he slipped and fell while trying to secure his fishing rod. Residents are now demanding that the Murang'a County government fences the dam as it poses a great danger to the residents.
Although building a fence to protect children from hippos may seem like a small ask for a government, especially one that boasts East Africa's largest and most developed economy, survey numbers as of 2023 to 2024 indicate that despite this promising stat, a staggering 16.1% of its population still lives below the international poverty line. The reasons for this are a combination of government corruption, economic inequality, and of course, widespread health problems. Factors which in fact plague many parts of the entire continent, and not just Kenya. It's not just the children and people of Maragua that are concerned, as many villagers in East Africa in general consider their surrounding rivers and lakes as lifelines, using them for daily activities such as bathing, fishing, and laundry. The sad part is, even those who are reluctant to go to the river are often forced to have to put their fears aside, and ironically risk their lives just to be able to survive. Not to mention, the 2019 pandemic saw the number of fishermen in Kenya, for instance, which were in the hundreds, increase to thousands due to the global economic crisis, which had even more of a detrimental effect to a large and already struggling population. And with Kenya being the 4th largest flower exporter in the world, thousands of flower workers around Lake Naivasha, for instance, famous for its high population of flamingos and hippos, lost their jobs when Europeans stopped buying them. This forced many to turn to fishing the lake for sustenance, thus leading to about 40 reported attacks at Lake Naivasha in 2020 alone, 14 of which were fatal. And remember, the actual number of attacks is likely much higher, especially when considering the trickle-down effect that the struggling economy had on the surrounding towns and villages. One can only imagine the trauma of witnessing someone being attacked, or even hearing accounts of it, as these people very often do. A bitter reality that they're forced to accept in order to put food on the table. These are the main reasons why hippos, and of course crocodiles too, are in many regions of Africa a very real and practically unavoidable threat for a people whose government, for the most part, continues to fail them in aspects as basic as safety. In the quaint, close-knit community of Wrightsville Beach, a charming town nestled just east of Wilmington, North Carolina, the early days of July 2018 were alive with excitement as the aftermath of Tropical Storm Chris, having swept through the Atlantic off the Carolina coast, had left behind superb waves and ideal surfing conditions.
There's that satellite picture.
Tropical
Very
Storm
active.
Chris swirls offshore.
Tropical Storm Chris is 200 miles away.
We get some swells across that region.
This unexpected boon drew surfers from far and wide, and among them was John Cheshire, affectionately known as Johnny Chesh by his friends. A Raleigh native residing in Wilmington, Johnny was very much familiar with Wrightsville Beach. He was well known in the North Carolina surfing community, often seen skillfully navigating the waves alongside his family, who shared his passion for the sport. On that fateful day in July, he was joined by his best friend of 20 years, Andrew Walden, his self-described best bro.
We knew that we were going to surf together this day because
you look at the forecast as a surfer, that's what you want waves. You're checking it probably 3-4 times a day.
Johnny and Andrew were well known for their many adventures together, and by all accounts were a dynamic duo that always brought a lively energy wherever they went. And even before Tropical Storm Chris had hit, the pair were both eagerly waiting for their next surf.
we were watching this Tropical Storm Chris that was off the coast. Those are our wave makers.
Most of the action is going to be in the form of big waves today. That's what you're going to find around the Outer Banks. 3 to 6 footers, maybe building up to about 7 or 8 by late this evening.
On the morning after the storm, Johnny, Andrew, and their friends Sean and Stinky P set out on Andrew's boat towards Masonboro Island, a secluded nature reserve and a well-known spot among local surfers where the quartet had hopes of catching some great waves. Upon reaching the island, a place untouched by roads, Johnny, Andrew, Sean, and Stinky P navigated through some narrow sandy trails to the beach, and what greeted them was a breathtaking view with perfect blue waves rolling onto the fine white sand. To the friends, the scene was ideal for a day of surfing. As they plunged into the water, each of them found their rhythm in the waves, reveling in the surprisingly warm water, which was a pleasant 85 degrees. However, unbeknownst to them, these inviting conditions were also appealing to various dangerous marine creatures. and the storm had brought in more than just ideal surfing conditions. It had also stirred the ocean's inhabitants, setting the stage for an unexpected encounter. As Johnny Chess struggled to catch a wave, he continued paddling tirelessly, moving around to find the perfect spot in an attempt to not strike out, a more common occurrence in surfing than one would think. Just as he was about to give up, he would finally spot an impressive wave rolling in. He then paddled with renewed energy, aligning himself as best as he could with the wave. Just as he reached the peak of his effort, ready to ride the wave, something unexpected happened. He would suddenly feel a sharp impact against his chest, followed by an intense jolt of pain that knocked him off his board and into the water. In the water, a confused Johnny struggled to breathe. The intensity of the pain was so great that he feared he might lose consciousness and drown. Not to mention, adding to his terror was the fact that he had no idea what attacked him. Hearing Johnny's cries for help, Andrew, who was just meters away, feared what to him was the worst-case scenario, as of course in the surfing world, a sudden fall and a scream usually meant one thing: sharks. And in North Carolina, known for its tiger and bull sharks, such encounters were not unheard of. In fact, both Johnny and Andrew were acutely aware of the shark risks in these waters. As Johnny surfaced, gasping and struggling for air, his mind raced with thoughts of a shark attack, which is when he frantically checked for blood in the water as his eyes scanned for the ominous gray shape. But he saw nothing. From a distance, Andrew called out to Johnny, trying to gauge if he was alright. He was watching as Johnny, still reeling from the shock, managed to clamber back onto his board. When he saw no blood or no missing limbs, Andrew breathed a sigh of relief, and for a moment even considered continuing with his surf, assuming Johnny was just fine. But the truth was that Johnny was far from alright. As he sat up on his board, he felt something clinging to his chest, and it was at this point that he realized that this was a jellyfish. In a quick reaction, he attempted to peel it off, but its tentacles then fastened to his lower chest and side. At this point, the pain that followed was so intense and blinding that Johnny likened it to being repeatedly poked by superheated coat hangers. Familiar with these waters from his years of freediving and spearfishing, Johnny assumed that what stung him was in fact not a jellyfish, but a Portuguese man-o'-war. Although not technically a jellyfish, Portuguese man-o'-wars are a colony of organisms known as zooids, each functioning like an organ of a single animal. However, locals would, despite this distinction, still refer to them as jellyfish. Overwhelmed by the intense pain of the sting, Johnny continued to fear that he might pass out and drown. He knew that he had to get back to shore quickly, despite struggling to breathe and move. With sheer determination, he managed to get back on his board and start paddling towards the beach, each stroke fueled by a mix of adrenaline and urgency.
Agonizing pain, and then also compounded by the fact that I'm 100 yards offshore and I got to get back into shore. I had so much adrenaline in me that with the pain, just my body was in full survival mode.
Johnny's friends, who were still nearby, at this point still had no idea of the danger that he was in, thinking that his lack of movement was just him taking a break. But as John started swimming towards the shore and the pain continued to intensify, John would yet again attempt to remove the jellyfish by peeling it off. However, this action would once again prove to be futile, as it only caused the jellyfish's tentacles to latch on even more fiercely, exacerbating his agony. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline at this point, likely due to all the pain he was feeling, Johnny would finally manage to tear the jellyfish off him and continue paddling towards the beach. As the pain continued to increase by the second, Johnny's mind began to blur, and he felt like he was at the brink of losing consciousness. This is when a thought of his wife and kids, both of whom depended on him, would flash through his mind, giving him a burst of strength which finally enabled him to reach the shore.
Really, the only thing through my mind was I wanted to get home to my family, make sure that Dad was going to be home for my little ones. I didn't want this to be the way that I went out. At that point in time, I knew that something wasn't right mechanically inside with the way my body was functioning. And all I could think about was I got to exfoliate this.
Once on the beach, realizing the gravity of his condition, Johnny would then, in a desperate move, grab a handful of sand and begin rubbing it on the sting site. Unbeknownst to him, this action triggered the release of even more venom from the tentacle cells that were still latched on to his skin, causing his pain to escalate dramatically. In fact, Johnny described this pain as akin to having a burning hot knife slicing into him repeatedly. But even that, he said, was an understatement, and the pain was in fact far worse than anyone could imagine. The tentacles of the box jellyfish, an intricate array of what could be likened to tiny spring-loaded traps, which are known scientifically as nematocysts, were embedded in the skin. These minuscule capsules, crafted by nature for both defense and predation, are inherently ready to inject venom from their yet-to-fire cells at the slightest provocation. As John's hands moved, pressing the grains of sand into his wound, he unknowingly applied mechanical pressure to these nematocysts. And like tiny, venomous landmines, these nematocysts responded to the pressure by firing, injecting additional venom into his already tortured body. Not to mention, the act of rubbing not only irritated the embedded tentacles, but also his skin, triggering a further release of venom. The nematocysts, sensitive to both touch and chemical signals, were at this point incited into a frenzied reaction. And to make matters worse, the rubbing motion in fact spread the tentacles over a larger area of his skin, increasing the zone of envenomation. And each movement and provocation caused more and more of these venomous cells to come into contact with his skin, unleashing their toxic payload. Back on the beach, a man, who was not part of the quartet but a friend of Johnny's, had noticed him laying on the beach, writhing in pain. Noticing the tentacles all over his skin, he would without hesitation suggest the old wives' tale remedy. We need to pee on the sting. But Johnny wasn't exactly keen on the idea of a golden shower.
The first person I see, luckily for me, is my friend Guyan. He sees me rolling around. He's like, Guyan, I got hit by a jellyfish. It's like, I don't think this is your typical jellyfish.
You gotta help me out.
You know, he looked at me and he could see it in my eyes. The first initial thing was, he's like,
Hey, we're gonna have to pee on you. Pee on me, man? Yeah.
And replied to him by saying, "No way, dude. Pee in a bottle, and I'll pour it on myself." Complying with his request, his friend would then pee into an empty bottle and hand it over to Johnny, who would then apply the urine to his sting. This action would instead cause the pain to intensify yet again. Now, the reason that this happened was that, in a nutshell, applying urine to a box jellyfish sting is not recommended and can in fact worsen the situation. The variable pH of urine and its composition make it an ineffective neutralizer of jellyfish venom. And more critically, it triggered the aforementioned undischarged nematocytes to release even more venom due to the changes in the osmotic balance around the sting area. Unlike, say, vinegar, which is recommended for its acidity and can help deactivate nematocytes, urine, contrary to popular belief, in fact lacks the necessary acidity that prevents further box jellyfish venom discharge. As Johnny's pain escalated even more, his skin would at this point begin to blister as he struggled to breathe and felt his blood pressure skyrocket. He knew that the venom was causing serious harm to his body, far beyond the initial sting. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Johnny's friends would finally notice him at the beach and quickly gather around him on the shore.
I didn't want to discount what had happened, but we get stung out there a lot. I tried to help him shake it off and just say, bro, you're gonna be fine. Let's get back out there, it's really fun.
First, he told me to suck it up. You know, he's like, it's just a jellyfish sting.
It looked like somebody had just whipped him pretty hard with the whip.
Andrew, who was particularly concerned, instantly knew at this point that Johnny needed urgent help. Andrew would at this point help Johnny get back to the boat, but before doing so would have to navigate the trails through which Johnny was barely able to walk, collapsing frequently, overwhelmed by nausea, and barely able to breathe. It was on the way to the boat that Johnny would express to his friends that these may be the last moments of his life. Upon hearing this, his best friend Andrew would then call EMS as soon as he got to the boat and began heading to the other side of the island.
John's one of my best bros, and when he told me I'm about to die, you know, it got real. I immediately went from, okay, not a big deal, to, well, let's make sure you don't die.
In an attempt to help soothe the stings, the friends then doused Johnny with fresh cold water, not realizing that this too was a mistake, as the fresh water triggered the remaining stinging cells to release even more venom. As Johnny's pain intensified even further, he at this point felt that he was on the brink of a heart attack, and it became increasingly clear to everyone that this was no ordinary sting, and they began to suspect that this was the work of a box jellyfish, not a man of war, a far more dangerous creature. In Andrew's own words, he was at this point goosing it, or in other words, pushing the boat's throttle to the max, causing it to slam against the waves as it propelled forward at full speed. This intense motion, however, would also have unintended consequences, as it caused even more of these venomous cells to fire into Johnny's body, worsening his already excruciating pain.
Hitting and hitting and hitting, and every time it hit, that pain just was like getting another gut punch. It's like, at that point, I'm going in and out.
As the men finally reached the beach, they spotted emergency personnel waiting. The crew, in an attempt to remove the stingers, scraped Johnny's wounds with a small razor blade. However, these efforts as well, which were meant to extract the tiny stingers from his chest, only intensified his agony, and it seemed at this point that nothing could go right for Johnny. The stingers were so minuscule that the scraping action triggered additional cells to release their venom, just as they had before. At this point, Johnny's ability to breathe was rapidly deteriorating, and the emergency team administered oxygen as well as a dose of fentanyl for his pain. The oxygen offered some relief, but the fentanyl, typically ineffective for box jellyfish sting pain, did little to help. As the crew hurriedly transported him to the New Hanover Regional Hospital in Wilmington, Johnny, upon his arrival, was reunited with his wife in the emergency room, where he described the pain as if his flesh were being torn apart from within and then melting in a fire. The box jellyfish's venom, pumping through his circulatory system with each heartbeat, continued causing him relentless and excruciating pain. This is when Johnny mentioned to the doctors that a Portuguese man-of-war was the likely culprit. However, upon a quick examination of his wounds and a discussion about the pain and the symptoms that he was feeling, the doctor would instantly offer a different diagnosis: that this isn't a man-of-war sting, you've been stung by a box jellyfish. Johnny, who had spent countless of hours diving and surfing in these waters, had in fact never encountered a box jellyfish, and the likely explanation for this was that Tropical Storm Chris disrupted their usual habitat. And although they're typically found in brackish, marshy areas, the storm's powerful winds had likely pushed these deadly creatures into the open ocean. And ironically, the same storm that provided Johnny and his friends with the perfect waves also brought him face to face with one of the most venomous creatures on the planet. Convinced that he was on the brink of death, Johnny continued to find no relief from the excruciating pain until doctors eventually applied hot compresses to the affected area.
And then at that point, it was more bearable, but pain went right back up. And he came back in, he goes, "How you feeling?" I said, "Look, man, whatever you've given me helps momentarily, but then it goes right back up to a 10. It's like, is there anything else you can do?" He's like, "Well, we've already given you the legal amount of medication that we can."
The heat began to denature the proteins in the box jellyfish's venom, deactivating them, significantly reducing his pain. However, Johnny was at this point still in a lot of pain, despite it having reduced, which is when the doctors informed him that he'd reached the legal limit of pain medication that could be administered without signing a waiver for additional doses. And the reason for this, of course, was that more pain medication could be life-threatening. However, in a state of unimaginable pain, and understandably so, Johnny didn't hesitate and would sign the waiver.
I sign it. He says, "All right," comes back in and gives me one more dose. And that's when I really felt, I was like, okay, I've got some pain relief finally.
Remarkably, just hours later, an extremely fortunate John would be discharged from the hospital, bearing significant scars which were etched in a pattern of the jellyfish's tentacles, serving as lasting reminders of his brush with death. Despite his ordeal, Johnny stated that he felt a profound sense of gratitude for being able to return to his passion of surfing. And reflecting on the incident, he expressed a deep understanding and acceptance of the risks associated with his beloved sport. I'm sure most of us remember the iconic Jaws scene when Quint told Brody and Hooper what he rightly considered to be the worst shark attack of all time.
1,100 men went into the water. Didn't see the first shark for about half an hour. 13-footer, you know that when you're in the water, Chief? You tell by looking from the dorsal to the tail.
However, despite going into some details about the horrifying event, his brief telling of them did little to explain the true horrors of that fateful night. The following is a detailed account of the notorious true story of the sinking of the USS Indianapolis and the fate of its crew members, 150 of which were attacked and killed in a tragedy that went on to be known as the most devastating shark attack in recorded history. The USS Indianapolis, a distinguished warship, had etched its name in the annals of World War II history, undertaking a mission of the utmost secrecy and critical importance. She was entrusted with the delivery of the vital components of the first operational atomic bomb, a cargo destined for a naval base on the remote Pacific island of Tinian. This clandestine operation was not just a pivotal moment in the war's trajectory, but a turning point in global military history, as it would play a major catalyst in what would eventually be known as the first nuclear bomb ever used in warfare.
He just delivered the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb.
Unbeknownst to the crew, this monumental task, intended to accelerate the conclusion of the global conflict with the aim of getting Japan to surrender, would soon be eclipsed by a series of harrowing and catastrophic events, and the ship's infamous tragic sinking was in fact just the beginning of an ordeal so profound and nightmarish that it would forever haunt the annals of naval history. And in the dark hours that followed the sinking, the surviving crew members would find themselves ensnared in a desperate struggle for survival, facing perils that went far beyond the horrors of war.
Very first light, Chief. Sharks come cruising.
It was on August 6, 1945 that the atomic bomb was deployed, resulting in unprecedented destruction as well as the aforementioned pivotal shift in the course of the Second World War. However, it was just days earlier, on July 28th to be precise, that the USS Indianapolis departed Guam without the safeguard of an escort, and this was most likely to stay low-key on what was meant to be a perilous journey to meet the battleship USS Idaho in Leyte Gulf, Philippines, as they readied for the impending invasion of Japan. The day began peacefully, with the Indianapolis making steady progress through the Pacific swells that were gently rocking the ship. The sailors on board enjoyed moments of respite as the sun dipped below the horizon, and card games, books, and conversations with the ship's priest, Father Thomas Conway, passed the time. It was shortly after midnight that disaster would strike. A Japanese torpedo struck the Indianapolis in the starboard bow, causing a huge explosion that blew off about 65 feet of the ship's front and igniting a large fuel tank, resulting in a massive fire that lit up the night sky. However, the assault didn't stop there, as a second torpedo hit the middle of the ship, causing her even further damage and causing fuel tanks as well as ammunition stores to explode one after the other, tearing the ship apart. And as if it were a scene straight out of a movie, the Indianapolis, a once strong and proud ship, was now split in half.
Bomb. 1,100 men went into the water. Vessel went down in 12 minutes.
In just 12 minutes, while still moving at 17 knots, the Indianapolis then sunk to the depths of the Pacific, and of the 1,196 men on board, 900 survivors were then left bobbing about in the open ocean as they watched the last of their vessel sink into the water below them. As the sun broke the horizon on the very next morning, the survivors found themselves adrift in the vast expanse of the ocean. Life rafts were scarce, pushing survivors to search for the deceased floating in the water so they could snatch their life jackets to help those without.
So we formed ourselves into tight groups.
They then began forming groups of varying sizes in the open water in a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of order and in hopes of fending off exposure, thirst, and of course the encroaching threat of sharks.
Oh, distress signal had been sent. They didn't even list as overdue for a week. Very first light, Chief. Sharks come cruising.
And the presence of thrashing bodies and spilled blood eventually lured sharks to the scene. But these weren't just any sharks. While a number of shark species inhabit open waters, none are more aggressive than the oceanic whitetip. Oceanic whitetip sharks are considered particularly dangerous in open water, and this is due to their often aggressive and opportunistic feeding behavior. They often display not only aggressiveness, but also assertiveness in approaching potential food sources, as well as a high sense of curiosity, and not to mention they don't discriminate, as their prey items have included humans. And what makes an encounter with this specific species of shark particularly dangerous is the fact that they typically inhabit remote, open ocean environments, which means that they pose a heightened risk, because if one is attacked, then typically help is far away. The first night saw the sharks targeting the floating deceased, but as the survivors' movements disturbed the water, more and more sharks ended up joining the feeding frenzy. And of course, sharks, armed with a remarkable biological feature known as the lateral line, which are a series of receptors sensing pressure and movement, were easily able to detect the living. And in particular, these were injured members of the crew, especially those that were bleeding out, that became their primary target. Observing this, survivors then tried to distance themselves as much as they could from those with open wounds, and when someone passed away, they would push their body away from them in an attempt to fend off the sharks. And as hunger began to set in, they were because of this fear still not even able to consume their meager rations, which consisted of just remnants like cans of Spam that they managed to salvage from the sinking ship.
Shark comes the nearest man, that man he start pounding and hollering and screaming. Sometimes the shark would go away. Sometimes he wouldn't go away. Sometimes that shark, he looks right into you. When he comes at you, he doesn't seem to be living. Oh, then you hear that terrible high-pitched screaming. The ocean turns red, and despite all the pounding and the hollering, they all come in, they rip you to pieces.
One particular group of survivors were so desperate for food that they went on to open a can of Spam, the scent of which proved irresistible to the sharks, who immediately started approaching and circling them, causing them to discard their rations in fear of being attacked. As days turned to nights, the air for the most part was filled with agonizing screams as more and more sharks gathered to feed on survivors. And to the horror of the remaining survivors, there was still no sign of rescue. And amidst this despair, the survivors discovered that their safety lay in numbers, with the center of the group being the ideal location, and those that were on the fringes, or worse, floating solo in the water, of course remained the most vulnerable to an attack. As the days and nights stretched on, unbearable heat and thirst would then lead some survivors to succumb to hallucinations. Many of them would see mirages which compelled them to drink seawater, which is of course a death sentence. Some crew members who were foaming at the mouth, with tongues and lips parched and swollen, and extreme fear and trauma coursing through their mind, especially due to the continuing threat of circling sharks, had then dragged their fellow survivors underwater in what were their final moments. It wasn't until the fourth day after the sinking, at 11 a.m., that a Navy plane flying overhead would spot the Indianapolis survivors and sent a desperate call for more help. And within hours, another seaplane piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks then landed in the shark-infested waters to rescue the remaining survivors. And later that same night, another naval ship, the USS Doyle, had reached the scene, pulling the last survivors from the water. Of the aforementioned 1,196 crew members, only 317 survived the sinking, and estimates regarding shark-related casualties vary from a few dozen to nearly 150. However, regardless of the precise number of those deceased, the Indianapolis crew and its survivors had undoubtedly endured what remains as the worst maritime disaster in U.S. naval history.
She was very, very powerful and very, very angry.
Just days ago, a woman was brutally mauled by a black bear just outside her home in Butler County, Pennsylvania. Now, this region of the states is surrounded by dense forestry and a variety of wildlife. This includes herbivores like the white-tailed deer and North American porcupine, to predators such as coyotes, red foxes, and of course, the American black bear. The incident occurred on March 5th at about 8:30 p.m. when 55-year-old Leigh Ann Gallant stepped out of her house with her dog, a small black Pomeranian named Smokey. As she stood on her deck, it only took a few moments for her to notice the silhouettes of 3 bear cubs in her neighbor's tree. Just seconds later, a mother bear suddenly appeared, jumped over the fence, and began charging at Smokey. This was when Leigh Ann began screaming at the bear in an attempt to scare it off. But to her misfortune, the bear was unfazed.
I honestly didn't think I was going to make it, and I couldn't believe this was happening.
The bear then bit into the back of her head and began pulling so hard that she thought she was being scalped, peeling her skin from behind her ears. During the mauling, Leigh Ann noticed that the bear kept shifting its attention from her to Smokey and back. At one point, with Smokey doing a good job of distracting the bear from its owner, the bear rushed at the dog and got very close to it before shifting its attention to Leigh Ann and biting into her left arm. With Smokey continuing to distract the bear, Leigh Ann then somehow managed to grab him and rush back inside the house, crawl to the phone, and call for help. Luckily, a Butler County police officer at the time had been at the nearby Church of God and was able to arrive at the scene relatively quick. This provided at least a sense of security for Leigh Ann, who was badly injured but conscious and alert. Emergency services then arrived a short time later, and Leigh Ann was rushed to Butler Memorial Hospital, where she had dozens of surgical staples applied to piece together the back of her head, additionally suffering a broken nose, several cuts inside her mouth, puncture wounds on her arm, and multiple gashes and scrapes throughout her body.
And she also has several broken bones of her nose and her face.
Pennsylvania Game Commission then sent out a team to capture the culprit bear and her cubs, and it didn't take long for them to find all 4 of them in a tree around the immediate vicinity where the attack took place. Because the bear continued reacting aggressively, officers were forced to euthanize her on the spot in what was a precautionary move to avoid further incident.
They'll go at least 60, 70 miles from here and get released into more of a wilderness area. But I'm leaning more towards caution and probably euthanizing these cubs to test them for rabies, just in case.
After their mother tested negative for rabies, and because they weren't directly involved in the attack, which would likely have resulted in them adopting the behavior from her, her cubs were then tranquilized and later released in an unknown area.
Her instinct for the mother bear is to protect her cubs, and I think it could have been a lot worse than it was.
Leigh Ann went on to mention that just a few weeks before the attack, neighbors had captured footage of a mother bear and her cubs on their home security cameras, which showed them accessing a bird feeder. However, they weren't spotted again. A lot of theories suggest that it's likely that the mother bear in the security camera footage was the same bear that attacked Leigh Ann. Neighbor Michael Vero, who'd heard Leigh Ann's screams as she was being attacked, mentioned that he'd been nervous for weeks as he knew that there had been bears in the area and was highly concerned for his children's safety. He went on to note that he feels a bit better now that the bears are gone. A few years ago, 19-year-old Olga Moskalyova and her stepfather Igor were fishing near the village of Termalny in eastern Siberia. However, what started off as a fun father and daughter fishing trip suddenly took a tragic turn when they were both killed in a deadly confrontation with a protective brown bear and her 3 cubs. But what makes this case particularly chilling and also unique is the fact that it was not only witnessed, but recorded on audio. These are the chilling details behind one of the most horrifying bear attacks in Siberian history. It was late August of 2011, and the warmer days in Siberia had finally arrived. And father and daughter Igor and Olga were extremely excited for a fishing trip that they'd been planning for months. As they packed their bags on that fateful morning, Tatiana, Olga's mother, who unlike her daughter and husband was not much of an outdoors person, couldn't shake this innate feeling of worry that she had about their safety. And this, coupled with the fact that Olga had just turned 19, gotten her driver's license, and also graduated music school, and not to mention the fact she was also a psychologist in training, that she was attending college with her boyfriend Stepan. Considering all these big changes in her daughter's life, Tatiana knew that she had to somehow accept the fact that her daughter is now grown up, and she shouldn't be so worried. So what she did was she started chalking all these feelings up to just natural motherly instincts, which over time will turn more positive, rather than all this fear and worry that she was feeling. Igor and Olga then took a direct and easy route to their intended fishing destination near some lush mountains in the Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky region, and shortly after arriving, settled at the banks of a local river. Back at home, Tatiana was still trying to shed her aforementioned concerns about her family's safety, assuring herself that it was only fishing and Olga and Igor were likely having a great time. And she wasn't wrong, as back at the river, Olga and Igor were peacefully fishing and enjoying the gorgeous mountain scenery around them. What they couldn't see had already by this time spotted them. After several hours of fishing, Igor and Olga then finally decided that they were done for the day, and so they started heading back to their vehicle. However, just halfway back to their car, Igor suddenly realized that he left the fishing rod behind. Back at home, Tatiana, who was finally able to go about her day and was not as worried about what was going on with her daughter, would suddenly receive a call from Olga. "Mom, the bear's eating me. It's such agony. Mom, help." At first, thinking it was a prank, Tatiana asked her, "Are you being serious?" But it didn't take long for her to realize that this situation was in fact very real, because coupled with the pain emitted from Olga's voice, Tatiana heard growling and chewing coming from what seemed like a bear. And it was at this point that she realized that her worst fears had come true and that her daughter was in mortal danger. The line then suddenly disconnected, and a traumatized and panicked Tatiana hurriedly called the police, as well as relatives in the village of Termalny, begging for them to rush to the river where Igor and Olga were fishing. Tatiana then tried calling Igor's cell phone, however she received no answer. Just seconds later, a second call from Olga. "Mom, the bear's back. She came back and brought her 3 babies. They're eating me." At this time, a horrified Tatiana could do nothing but wait, as none of her calls to Olga or Igor were being answered, despite numerous attempts. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that a third and final call would come in from Olga, and this was to the relief of Tatiana, who felt like since it's been an hour and I'm getting a call, this is most likely good news and Olga may have gotten away. However, unfortunately, this was not the case, and on the other end of the line, a very peaceful and calm sounding Tatiana this time would let out the following words. "It's not hurting anymore. I don't feel the pain. Forgive me for everything. I love you." And that was the last time that Tatiana ever heard from her daughter or her husband. About 30 minutes after Olga's last call to her mother, Igor's brother Andrei would finally arrive with the police at the river, and just minutes later, they would discover Igor's body still being fed on by the bears, and not far away from him, they would also find Olga's severely mangled body. 6 hunters were later sent in to kill the mother bear and her 3 cubs, who likely would have become repeat offenders having now tasted human meat. Numerous reports later specified the grisly details of what took place, and this included details extracted from the nearly hour-long recordings of the 3 phone calls Olga had placed to her mother whilst being attacked. Now the following is a sequence of attacks according to the details, and I've gathered this from reports. Numerous reports pretty much say the same thing, and I do want to mention that viewer discretion, or listener discretion rather, is advised, especially for this particular part. As Igor walked back to retrieve the fishing rod he'd forgotten by the river near some tall grass, he was suddenly ambushed by the mother bear, who proceeded to, according to reports, break his neck and smash his skull. Meanwhile, Olga, who was witnessing this, then panicked and attempted to flee, managing to gain just 70 yards before being snagged and forced to the ground by the powerful brown bear, initiating the final hour of her life in which she placed the 3 phone calls to her mother. Now, although bear attacks have seen an uptick over the years in Siberia, a lot of reports indicate that this is due to human encroachment, such as fishing nets and other obstacles, that has lessened the amount of salmon available in the rivers, and so bears are much more desperate, especially during hibernation time or post-hibernation time when they just come out of it and they're super hungry. And so attacks are more likely to happen when bears are in that state, when there's a shortage of food. And humans, of course, we have the cognitive capacities, I say this a lot, in order to take these precautions. These are just animals at the end of the day. So we have to make sure, especially when heading into areas where these wild animals and dangerous animals live in their habitats, you have to make sure that you're prepared. Had Igor, for example, had bear spray, or had he been armed, then he most likely would have been able to deter the situation from occurring and saved his and his daughter's life. However, once again, these things are very rare, and you'd have to be at the wrong place at the wrong time for them to happen. There's millions of people going camping every year and not many attacks that happen. That doesn't mean that they can't happen, and many of those people are prepared and they do know the risks of venturing out into these places. Just yesterday, that's January 29th, 2024, 29-year-old Lauren O'Neill, a keen kayaker believed to have recently purchased a home in the region, was badly bitten by a shark during an evening swim at a private wharf at Sydney Harbour in New South Wales, Australia. Now, it was at about 7:45 p.m. that a dramatic scene unfolded at Billiard Avenue and Elizabeth Bay when Lauren, who'd been swimming just 20 meters from the jetty at the time, was mauled by what authorities now believe to be a large bull shark, causing severe injuries to her right leg. So a local who was at the scene, he ran out of his house upon hearing Lauren's blood-curdling screams and immediately noticed her propped up on the ladder external to the harbor pool, struggling to pull herself out of a large patch of blood-red water. So locals, they quickly alerted authorities, but due to the rapid blood loss, they knew that something had to be done quick, and they had no time to wait. Now, miraculously, a local vet had been walking by during the time and witnessed the crowd gathered at the beach, and would promptly rush over to Lauren and apply a tourniquet to her leg to help slow the bleeding.
My wife's a vet, and she basically bandaged it up, and the bone's broken, and it's pretty hectic actually.
Oh, it was a completely surreal experience. I just got home from work at about 20 to 7. I'd sat down on the couch, and just as I sat down, I heard a soft yell for help from outside. I looked outside, and Lauren was sort of propped up on the external ladder of the harbour pool coming out of the harbour, and behind her was just dark red blood. And it was just surreal. I grabbed my phone and sprinted outside, called 000. My neighbour Simon was sitting on the stairs outside on the harbour's edge as well. He also called 000, and we just went straight down to her. We were by her side, reassuring her that everything was going to be okay. Within seconds, many more neighbours came down with towels, and Fiona is an absolute hero. I believe that she saved her life. She's a vet, and she had tourniquets and wraps and got straight into action. And yeah, everyone worked well. I stayed on the phone with 000 and relayed any information regarding when the ambulance would be there. People were holding her hand, people were talking to her to keep her awake. And yeah, everyone just sort of worked together to make sure that she was going to be all right.
As a local ambulance arrived at the scene at about 8 p.m., paramedics from St. Vincent's Hospital assessed and treated Lauren's wounds as best as they could, but upon doing so, realized that not only was time of the essence, but if they didn't call for backup quick, they were likely going to lose her. This was when an ambulance helicopter was promptly dispatched to the scene from Bankstown, bringing with it crucial blood transfusion products and a specialized doctor who was able to stabilize Lauren at the scene before transporting her by road to St. Vincent's Hospital, just about 1.5 kilometers away.
Our paramedics found her on a private wharf with significant lower limb injuries and a large amount of blood loss.
So an investigation has been launched in hopes of finding out what species of shark it was that was responsible for the attack, and thus far all signs, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, are strongly pointing to this being the work of a large bull shark, one that locals at the scene had as well reported to have sighted frequently at the wharf.
Yeah, it was around dusk as well, so
that's not a great time to be swimming from what I understand, given sharks and things in the harbour. But she was swimming external to the harbour pool. There's a netted harbour pool, and she was on the outside of it. So swimming around boats, and then sort of came back into the ladder which attaches to the harbour pool. And that's when I saw her sort of propped up. So not sure at what point the shark had hit her, whether it was a little bit early before she made it to the ladder, or as she was getting out, perhaps climbing up the ladder, then it got her. It's difficult to know exactly what happened, but all I know, what I saw was it was not good.
Dramatic footage on social media would then arise, posted by locals who had witnessed the incident, or at least the aftermath of it. Footage which showed Lauren being carried away on a stretcher and transported from the jetty to the ambulance. Now, City of Sydney Councillor Linda Scott would later issue a public statement saying that she was extremely concerned to hear about the attack, and she went on to urge locals and anyone else to please stay out of the harbour until further notice. Lauren went on to suffer significant injuries to her leg, and she also lost a massive amount of blood, but doctors at St. Vincent's, they've worked tirelessly all night to ensure that she doesn't lose her leg, and as of the latest update, it appears that she's thankfully in stable condition. When it comes to snake bites, India is the country that sees the most cases on an annual basis at 81,000 per year. Now, unfortunately, 11,000 of these cases, they do result in death, and typically this happens when people are maybe out in the bush, because this does happen a lot in rural regions of India. They might be out in the bush, they might step on a snake, and maybe the snake will turn around, react defensively, and give them a bite on the ankle. However, there are certain cases, which are much rarer, where people have used snakes as murder weapons. Now, this case had actually happened at the end of last year in India. It made national headlines, and it was more specifically in October when a 23-year-old woman named Basanti Patra and her 2-year-old daughter Debasmita were mysteriously found dead in their bedroom. So on the night of October 6, 2023, Basanti and her 2-year-old daughter Debasmita, they had been preparing for bed in their modest home in Odisha's Ganjam district. To be more specific, it was a place called Kabi Surya Nagar. However, little did they know that this would be the last night of their lives. So the very next morning, which was October 7th, Ganesh went on to alert all his neighbors. He was very distraught, and he was saying that how a cobra entered his house and somehow managed to bite his daughter and his wife while they were sleeping. So multiple villagers rushed over to the house after this, and they ended up finding a lifeless Basanti and Debasmita just laying there on their bed. So the mother and daughter, they were immediately rushed to the hospital, and unfortunately they were declared dead upon arrival. Now, what happened was, in the following days, an investigation was conducted in order to identify and confirm the cause of death, which, according to Ganesh's report, was a snake bite. So not long after this, the post-mortem was released, and authorities ended up classifying the death as an unnatural death via cobra envenomation. Now, Ganesh at this time, he was loving all the attention that he was getting, and he was garnering sympathies from his neighbors and from all his friends and family. Basanti's devastated father, Kali Patra, he was not really buying that this was an accident, and he actually started getting super suspicious, because as days went by and his emotions stabilized from having lost his daughter, he started thinking back at the couple's situation, which I'm about to get into. He's like, there's no way that this was an accident. This had to have been a murder, and Ganesh must be the culprit. Now, Kali, the father, he had really strong reasoning for this, and it was mainly because Ganesh and Basanti, who'd gotten married in 2020, they were not long into the start of their new lives together. They just had their daughter actually in 2020 as well, the same year they got married, and just months into their marriage, they started having problems. They started fighting a lot, and it was really Ganesh that seemed to be the culprit most of the time, according to reports. It seemed like he was very abusive towards her. See, Ganesh had been working for a construction company in Himachal Pradesh, and he had just come home for a vacation about 4 months prior to this incident. Now, instead of going back to work, he ended up staying with his wife and child, and during this time, he ended up fighting a lot and quarreling a lot with her. He started harassing her for money, and because of this, Basanti actually ended up filing a complaint with the police against him under the country's Dowry Prohibition Act. In case you don't know what dowry is, I've covered this in a previous episode, and it's essentially where the bride gives a gift to the husband's family in order for his hand in marriage. It's kind of like very opposite It's kind of like a really outdated tradition, but it still happens in a lot of places, not just in India and also a lot of other cultures apparently. But yeah, because she filed this complaint, Ganesh knew that he could no longer squeeze any money out of her. So he was super unsatisfied, and so he started picking and finding other reasons to quarrel with her. And the biggest reason that he could find, and the one that he stuck with, was that he figured that she was unfaithful to him. So he started accusing her of infidelity, and he started claiming that she's having an affair with another man, and they didn't really name who this man was. I'm not even sure if he even knew who this man was, just an ex-person, right? So in an attempt to save her marriage, and understandably so, she has a baby, and they just got married. She's young, and it doesn't really look good at all in those cultures and those communities in India, especially smaller villages, for a woman to divorce somebody. So even if she was unhappy, she was willing to do what she could, the best she could, to make this marriage work. So she ended up enrolling the couple for marriage counseling. It never ended up working. And then finally she ended up approaching her family and, really spilling the beans to them, telling them that, hey, this is what's happening. And apparently, led by her father, Kali Patra, the family ended up having an intervention with both her and Ganesh. It seemed like that was very successful, according to reports, and the couple ended up giving it another shot. And it was not long after this family intervention that, of course, this tragedy ended up occurring just months later. So knowing all this and kind of just replaying all these events back in his head, Basanti's father, Kali, ended up filing a police report accusing Ganesh of using the snakes to kill his wife and his daughter. So as police confronted Ganesh, his story was quite inconsistent at this time, because originally he had kind of said that he doesn't know how this happened. He knew it was a snake bite, but he never really drew a proper picture as like, oh, there was a cobra that came into the house and I found it in the room after, or anything like that. No, he didn't do that initially. But then when he was confronted, he ended up presenting all these specific scenarios of how it could have happened. So they were kind of concerned. It's like, how is he getting so specific all of a sudden when before he was very vague about everything? So that really didn't add up for them, and it kind of grew the police's suspicions as well to believe the father and look into this case and use resources to look into this case even more. So as the police delved deeper into this case, they ended up discovering that Ganesh had not only purchased a new SIM card recently on September 26th, so just a couple weeks before the incident, or just a week before the incident or so, he also ended up putting that SIM card under his father's name, under Ganesh's father's name. So why would you do that? Why would you purchase a SIM card, first of all, just days before this when you already have your own phone? And, this happens just days after. Just didn't really make any sense. It was very suspect for the police. And so the seemingly minor detail, it ended up opening up this whole new avenue for investigation. They really, really got suspicious at this point. And they ended up thinking that this guy definitely premeditated this murder. And this guy seems much more sinister than how he's appearing, as this like grieving husband and father. So the police began questioning locals at this point, and they ended up getting directed to some snake charmers. So then they started questioning all these snake charmers, all these local snake charmers, until they reached one man, finally, who admitted that he'd sold a snake, a cobra more specifically, to Ganesh on October 6th, which is the day before the reported death of Basanti and Deba Smita. So it was at this point that the investigation ended up taking a dramatic turn, and it was believed that Ganesh was the one who had released the cobra into the room while his daughter and wife were sleeping, and that's when the bites occurred. So it really went against all his initial claims of that he found them like that, and everything at this point, all the evidence, it seemed to point towards the fact that he had orchestrated this scenario to make these deaths appear as snake bites. So after intense scrutiny and gathering of evidence for over a month, everything piled up against him, and Ganesh really had no defense at this point, and he finally ended up admitting to everything that he did, and he confessed that he had actually been the one who had killed his wife and his 2-year-old daughter. Now, he ended up detailing the entire sequence of events. It's disturbing to hear, but this is what happened. So in his confession, Ganesh actually detailed exactly how he'd obtained the snake. He said that he'd gotten it from a snake charmer named Basanta Acharya, who was a local snake charmer once again. He obtained the snake not long before he'd planned on using them to kill his wife, but he'd obtained it under the guise of him wanting to do a special ritual or religious ceremony at a Shiva temple or perhaps at home. A couple of different articles said two different things, so I'm not sure which one of those it was. But regardless, he said he wanted it for a religious ceremony. Now, once he'd requested for it, I'm pretty sure he paid him for the snake. He took the plastic jar which the snake was contained in, he hid it at home, and then on October 6th, that night, once it hit 2 a.m., so October 7th technically, he released the snake into the middle room of the house. That's where he'd had his wife and his daughter sleeping, and he'd been sleeping in the front room. So he just released it in there, closed the door, and that was that. Eventually, the snake ended up biting both of them. Both of them got bitten around the ankle areas. And the really curious part as well was that no screams were heard. And this really reminds me of a previous case that happened with a woman named Uthra, where her husband Suraj, this happened in Kerala, he actually sedated his wife. She was actually mentally disabled, the poor woman. He sedated her, and then he got multiple snakes to bite her. He tried twice to get her killed. Once was with a Russell viper, and once was with a cobra, and a monocle or spectacle cobra rather. And it was devastating, just that case itself. But here you have a 2-year-old who was killed as well, and the fact that both of them never let out any screams. No, this happened in a small village, so if they did scream and if there was a big scene, then probably multiple people would have heard, and maybe they would have been able to get the mother and daughter Basanti and Debasmita to the hospital on time, and maybe their lives would have been saved. But no screams were heard. So this led officials and authorities who'd read this part of the confession and even analyzed or investigated this case to believe that perhaps Ganesh went and sedated his 2-year-old daughter and his 23-year-old wife Basanti so that they wouldn't wake up to the pain, which is definitely severe when it comes to cobra envenomations. So once again, it's extremely tragic how this case happened. Rest in peace to Basanti and her daughter Debasmita. I really think that Basanti was likely a good woman really trying to save her marriage. Unfortunately, this man Ganesh did not see it that way, and now he's paying the punishment with his life. Hopefully he's been served or sentenced to life. I'm not able to find his sentence, but what I did do was gather information on the sentence that happened with Suraj, the other case I was telling you about, which happened in Kerala. But he was sentenced to 17 years of rigorous imprisonment, as well as double life sentences to be served concurrently. And also he was fined 5.85 lakh rupees, which is 585,000 rupees. But yeah, once again, I'm pretty sure a similar sentence was handed out to Ganesh, but I couldn't find any information on what the exact sentence was for him. But I really hope that this guy pays with rigorous imprisonment and hopefully even a larger fine and triple life sentences. I don't know, the worst that they can think of. In my opinion, this guy deserves a death penalty. But anyways, if you do want to check out the story of Uthra, I will leave it for you at the end screen of this video. This was a tragic case, and I just wanted to share it with you. Do hit that like and subscribe button if you're new. My name is Animal Al. I'll see you on the next one.